It is such an honor to be here with all of you. This is an incredible community. Do you know how incredible this community is? Like, it just feels like, really? It felt like instantaneous friends as soon as I met them. Had dinner with them. The people who put this together, did you hear them sing? Like, I'm blown away by the interconnected building up of each other that is in this space. Do you know that I've spent my entire life in ministry, and I've been looking for a kind of community that the church is supposed to be. And you guys are doing that here. And I want you to know how important that is. We know, we hear about it every day, about how bad toxic community is. But community is also the answer. Good community brings healing. And you are doing part of that incredible, important work here today. So thank you so much for letting me be a part of your incredible community tonight. I wanted to start off by sharing that my wife and I welcomed our daughter, Reese May, into the world on March 29th. And I brought a little picture of her. Do we have her up there? Oh. So it's not just me. She is objectively cute, right? Okay. My good. So we had a really hard birth at the hospital, so we chose to have her at home. Our firstborn Foster, we had her at home and went through all the same things with midwives and things like that. And she was going into labor, my wife was, and midwives weren't there. So guess who got to deliver her? I will be forever changed by that moment. I'm like, they're not here and I'm here. This is what I get to do right now. It was just the most incredible experience. So she's 8 weeks old and my wife is home with our little boy Foster. I brought a picture of our whole family together. Isn't he cute? My little pal. So she's 8 weeks old and he's 2. He turned 2 5 days before she was born. He never asked for a baby sister for his birthday, but that's what he got. And so she's born eight weeks ago, and coincidentally, that was the last time I got any sleep. And the last time I showered was last night in the hotel. Let me give you a little snapshot of my life right now. It's 3 a.m. You got it in your minds? Okay, 3 a.m. I've just spent 45 minutes feeding Reese because she's got some feeding issues with her mouth. I get her laid down in the bassinet, the noise machines. It sounds like mission control in our room right now, right? We lay her down in the bassinet next to the bed. My wife's asleep, she's asleep, and it's like there's landmines on the floor. And you just got to be, because it's all wood floors, because that was a great decision for babies. And you're trying to find the planks that don't creak, right, back to the bed. And I finally get to bed. No one's awake. The baby's asleep. My wife's asleep. I've got her in the bassinet, and my 2-year-old's monitor is on my nightstand, right? And I'm laying down. I look at the clock. It's 3:45. I got to be up in just a couple of hours. And I'm falling asleep, and then I hear my 2-year-old move. I'm just like, that's when whether you believe in God or not in that moment, you're like, please, God. Please just let him go back to sleep. Then it's like he moves into the mic of the monitor. And you hear, poo-poo dada. Seriously, it's never poo-poo mama. It's poo-poo dada. So that's the snapshot of my life. All that to say, I'm in the perfect stage to come talk to you about the importance of mental health. Oh, and when you're out of town for the first time, you hear them as you're falling asleep still. I think every parent knows that. I was born and raised in Idaho, and this is the first time in the deep South, right? Is this deep South? Because the furthest before this was Kansas City, so that's not the South. So this is the furthest South this Idaho boy has been, right? There's a problem with geography here, because I've heard Iowa 100 times. I've heard Ohio. Idaho is the state next to Washington and Oregon on that side of the continent, okay? Idaho. Born and raised in Idaho, and I spent my entire life in the church. I felt called to be a pastor around 7 years old, and I spent my entire life in ministry within the church. For the majority of that time, I had an undiagnosed anxiety and depression due to some things I experienced as a child that were never talked about, confronted, or healed. And it took a terrifying encounter with suicidal ideation in 2016 to finally make me reach out to someone and start talking about my mental health, let alone take it seriously. I was laying in bed one night and I really thought I had no reason to live anymore. We talk about that moment when all of your trauma and your pain collide, and that was the moment that I was experiencing that night in 2016. I thought I had no more reason to live. I was 3 years into pastoring a small church of about 80 people, and I was in my mid-20s, and I was the youngest person there by 20 years. The only person on ministry staff trying to help this church survive and come in to the 19th century. I know it's the 21st century, but I would have settled for the 19th century. And I was trying to do everything that the church asked of me and the expectations of what it meant to be a pastor. I was a landlord for the rental property. No one trained me to be a landlord in seminary. I was an accountant. I didn't have a single accountant class in seminary. They don't teach you how to do those things. As well as trying to build a children's ministry and a youth ministry from the ground up, all on top of the general ministry demands of my job. And the building was 80 years old and falling apart on top of that too. My masculinity and my sexuality and my leadership abilities were all constantly being questioned by those in my inner circles because I was unmarried, young, and fresh out of seminary. I must not have been knowing what I was doing. I was also vegetarian and gluten-free, which in Idaho essentially makes you a communist. I was also only making less than $20K a year and barely able to cover my expenses, including my own health insurance. And the church also mismanaged my financial package for several years, where I was overtaxed on almost double of what I was actually making. I didn't have anyone advocating for me because I was the senior pastor. I was the lead pastor of that church. And I didn't know how to advocate for myself. I knew I couldn't survive this life that I had stepped into and knew very little about. I knew it academically, but stepping into that position, I knew very little of what I was going to face in that context. And I knew I wasn't going to survive it much longer. By the time I'd stepped into that position, I had gained more than 30 pounds in just 3 years because of stress of the assignment. And I would regularly have panic attacks not knowing what they were and spend days that I actually got off just in bed, not connecting with anyone and stowing myself away. I learned that failure wasn't an option and quitting was a form of failure. So I felt like I had nowhere to turn. So laying there that night, I thought that was going to be my reality forever. Everything was closing in on me, and I thought there would be no way out. I felt utterly alone. And it was around 3 a.m, and in that moment of desperation, I felt myself getting up out of bed to go take some action against myself. And then I felt something else. My 55-pound boxer crawled up onto my chest. And she laid down on me and put her paws over my shoulders, and she put her head right here. She'd never done something like that before in the middle of the night, and I think she could sense the immensity of what I was going through. And I just started to weep. I felt seen and I felt noticed. And my first thought was, who's going to feed her tomorrow? Who's going to take care of her? I'm the only one in the house. And it was that love that she showed me, and I knew that I loved and cared for her too, that brought me back into that moment and gave me just a little bit of purpose to keep going. I'd adopted, her name is Ripley, believe it or not. Depending on your age, you'll get that joke. I try to do Lieutenant Ripley from the movie Aliens, and that one just falls flat all the time. This is my favorite joke to make. But I adopted her from the Humane Society in 2014 after a breakup, which I don't recommend going to the Pound or the Humane Society after a breakup without a friend who can keep you in check, because you will adopt all of the dogs and cats in that place after a breakup. Am I right? Right? Okay. But before that, I used to think that those bumper stickers that said, I rescued my dog and then my dog rescued me, were really silly and cheesy. But in that moment, I understood. Animals, the natural world can embody God in ways that language we can't speak. Dogs often embody God's love better than many humans do. Many humans who claim to worship God. Dogs can embody God's love, and I experienced that. Well, that night scared me so much that the next morning when the sun rose, I called my mom right away and thank the Lord for good parents who will hear you, right? I called my mom the next morning, and then I called my doctor, and then I called a therapist. And I went and I was eventually diagnosed with PTSD, anxiety, and depression. My therapist told me for the first time that I was caught in extreme swings between fight and flight modes, and I didn't know how to get away from it. I was stuck in the mindset of a scared 7-year-old boy when that trauma first happened. And I was still operating that way in my late 20s. And I went through 6 months of EMDR therapy to work through those things and was put on a regimen of medication, and not only addressing my current mental illness, but addressing those traumas that I had endured as a child and never got to talk about with someone in professional mental health circles. Looking back on this now, I find myself asking why I wasn't diagnosed earlier, why I hadn't stepped out and talked about these things earlier before getting to that kind of extreme point. If I was in the church my entire life, why hadn't I talked about this sooner? And that's the question to the general church, not to you here who are doing that, but why aren't the church, why was I not able to talk about this sooner? And I think I've keyed in on just a few factors I want to share with you tonight that you might resonate with as well. Factors that all led to the same outcome, what I call isolation. These things that isolated me from addressing my mental health, from addressing spirituality, from addressing these things clearly so I could be healthy again. And the first factor is the position of lead pastor isolated me. Anyone who served in any leadership position knows how isolating leadership can be. Anybody know what that feels like? Within many churches, we wrongly expect the pastor to be a CEO, president of the board, fundraiser, facility manager, MC, and especially in small churches, accountants, insurance and liability experts, landlords, and so much more, all on top of their full-time duties to care for the spiritual needs of their community. And we expect them to do this all on their own. Not only is this not sustainable, but it is a recipe for disaster. Anyone have heard of abuse allegations and things like that in the church? It's connected to how we isolate these leaders. I can't help but think of how we are creating recipes for mental breakdowns among pastors, and it's connected to the abuse that we're seeing in the church too, because we are isolating that leadership position. So it lacks accountability, and it also lacks holistic, healthy practices for a position like that. And that can't help but bleed down and cause harm or health depending on how that pastor is caring for themselves. The other thing that isolated me was stories that I believed about my masculinity. Not only was I a pastor, but I was a man. And men, especially Idaho bearded mountain men like myself, we were supposed to be able to do these things on our own, never complaining, never asking for help, never showing any emotion and fighting off the occasional grizzly bear with our bare hands. This kind of rugged, individualistic, repressive definition of manhood was very isolating as well. Combined this with the definition of pastor, and it's no wonder I saw asking for help as a sign of failure. And the last thing that I felt like isolated me, second to the last thing, was economic. I couldn't afford consistent medical or mental health care, and it isolates far too many people from getting the help they need. Structures within our church and our society need to change in order to make quality mental and physical health care accessible and affordable. And the church needs to be on the forefront of that change. Lastly, the other thing that isolated me was bad theology. Anybody encounter that before? A theology that defined excessive worrying over selfish things as the same thing as anxiety. A theology that taught me that if I just prayed hard enough and had enough faith and just worked harder, I could overcome my mental illness by myself with God. A theology that defined reaching out for help beyond prayer, beyond the church, was a sin. And leaving many like myself feeling like there really wasn't anywhere to turn. If you're going to violate your relationship with God, how dare you turn away and seek help outside your relationship with God? My friends, I don't say things like this lightly, but bad theology kills. Bad theology kills. Trying to address mental health with just prayer is the same as trying to confront gun violence with thoughts and prayers. It leads to disaster. This is my personal story, but I know everyone's mental health journey is different, and I just want to leave you with a bit of encouragement tonight. I want to encourage you to really understand the things that are isolating you right now. If you are in a leadership position that doesn't have the proper structures in place that leave you isolated and alone, you are free to demand better structures. And you are free to quit if those structures aren't put in place. And I didn't know that when I was in that position. Otherwise, I would have taken that action. If you have a definition of yourself that emphasizes rugged individualism and takes independence too far and define asking for help as a failure, I encourage you to find better and more fuller understandings of yourself and your place in the world. You have value, you matter, and you deserve for advocacy. And that advocacy starts with you. Advocate. You are free to advocate for yourself. Needing things isn't a failure. Do you believe that? To need something isn't a failure. In fact, we fail one another when we shame each other for needing things. I want to encourage you to continue to untether yourself from bad theology. It takes time to untether yourself from that stuff. I would know. Mental illness isn't a sin. What is sinful is when we Christians use bad theology to minimize mental health and isolate people who are suffering through our policies and structures, all of which discourage them from seeking help from qualified mental health professionals. That is what's sinful. God heals through community too. God heals through rethinking bad structures and bad theology to bring about restoration. And God heals through therapists too. There are many ways that God heals, and we just need to find the things that are isolating us and separating us from that healing, that restoration and growth, and give ourselves the permission to accept that love from other people that helps us just to take even one step towards healing and wholeness again. God did not create us for isolation. God created us for community, for healing and wholeness. Make that what you seek in your mental health journey. Thank you.